They say when you walk away from the noise of the world, you begin to hear what matters. For me, that meant waking up to the rustle of wind through ponderosa pines, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, and the slow, steady hum of the land breathing under my feet. My name is Samuel Lorne. And after 37 years working as a federal conservation scientist, I retired to the place I longed for since my 20s, a modest cabin tucked against the foothills on the western edge of Alder Hollow. A town barely big enough for a post office and a barbershop. The cabin wasn't much, just timberstone and stories soaked into every floorboard, but the land around it was sacred to me. My 5-acre lot wasn't the kind of place real estate agents drooled over. Too steep, too wooded, too raw, they'd say. But to me, it was a living library. The soil held memory. And the trees, they were guardians. I wasn't hiding from the world, just stepping back. After decades of battling bureaucrats and industry lobbyists over wetland setbacks and floodplain protections, I had nothing left to prove. I wasn't bitter, just tired. The world hadn't changed much, but I had. I didn't want to argue anymore. I just wanted to listen to the land, let it teach me again. So I did, day after day. I hiked the ridges at dawn. I cataloged birds for my own records just as I had in field journals from the 80s. I rebuilt an old footbridge over the seasonal stream that ran through my lower slope. I watched how it rose with the spring melt and receded into trickles by late July, the way it always had. People rarely came up here, which was just fine with me. My nearest neighbor was 3/4 of a mile down the hill, a retired nurse who left sourdough bread on my porch every other Sunday. The rest of the valley below had over the last 10 years been slowly consumed by something that hadn't existed when I first bought the land. Mountain Pines HOA. They'd started small, a few luxury homes, with man-made waterfalls and stamped concrete patios, a community center with weekly yoga and silent book clubs. Nothing against that, really. I've seen worse land uses, but then came the fences, the uniformity, the smiling enforcers in embroidered red vests. Suddenly, everyone wanted control of grass-height mailbox-shaped parking direction. The HOA operated like a miniature regime, and the locals either joined it or fled from it. I did neither. I was never part of the HOA. My land predated the subdivision protected by legacy zoning and an independent parcel ID. My boundaries were clear, and I had the deeds to prove it. Still, they didn't like my noncompliance. They'd send friendly notices about overgrown easements or suggested updates for visual cohesion. I ignored them, politely. The truth is, I didn't trust them. Not because I was paranoid, I'd just seen enough in my career. HOA boards with too much power and not enough knowledge were more dangerous than bulldozers. They didn't understand ecosystems, only aesthetics. And what scared me most was that the slope behind my cabin, the ridge, thick with Douglas fir and cottonwoods, wasn't just pretty. It was critical. Decades ago, back in my federal days, I'd worked on a regional flood control study for this watershed. Heavy spring storms would run off the mountains, fast carving channels and pushing debris downstream. The only reason Alder Hollow hadn't experienced a major flood since 1972 was because of natural buffers like mine-forested slopes that absorbed water and slowed flow. That ridge behind my cabin was mapped into a low-grade flood control zone. Not a formal federal easement, but flagged in our system for its ecological function. I helped map it. I knew its worth. And now I feared the HOA might see it as overgrowth. They had no jurisdiction on my land, but that never stopped ignorance before. And it certainly wouldn't stop it now. I spent the winter of that year cleaning out a tool shed, sorting old topo maps, aerials, and correspondence with the All-Army Corps of Engineers. It wasn't nostalgia. It was insurance, just in case. The letter started in April, one envelope after another, with Mountain Pines, HOA, letterhead, stamped notice in bold red letters. They weren't threats, not outright. Just community concerns about fire risks from overdense foliage. The trees they referenced were 70 years old. Fire adapted, native. I wrote back. I sent printouts. I offered to meet and explain. They didn't respond. By May, the notices stopped. and I allowed myself to hope. Maybe they'd moved on. Maybe they'd finally realized I wasn't a threat to their clean little kingdom. I went back to my hikes, my notebooks, my solitude, until the morning the chainsaws came. It was June 2nd. I remember because the air was unusually thick, that pre-storm stillness that smells like wet earth before it even rains. I was on my porch, coffee in hand, when I heard the first crack of bark splitting open, followed by the unmistakable roar of machinery. I ran down the trail, through the ferns and underbrush. I'd cleared 100 times, my boots skidding on wet pine needles. The sound grew louder, more than one saw, more than one worker. I burst through the tree line and into the clearing near the stream, and froze. 3 men in orange vests were sawing through the base of a fir tree older than I was. Another stood by a small backhoe, already gouging a trench near the waterline. And behind them, in a spotless red vest and sun visor, stood Karen Marks, HOA president. She turned as I approached, clipboard in hand, lips pursed like a schoolteacher catching a child swearing. "You're trespassing," I said before she could speak. She raised an eyebrow. "This is community land now. We voted to extend visual access along the ridgeline. Fire risk assessments back our plan. You'll be receiving the resolution shortly." I couldn't speak for a moment. Not from shock, but from the heat of anger rising in my chest. The kind that comes not from being wronged, but from watching years of work erased by ignorance. "You have no right to be here," I said, voice low. "This slope is on my deed. That stream is protected. Those trees are part of a mapped flood control zone." She smiled. "That's outdated data, Mr. Lorne. The town's new survey doesn't show any of that. This land is part of our new Phase 4 Greenbelt. We're beautifying it for everyone's benefit." I stared at her. The saw behind her snarled as another fir fell. And just like that, I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was war. The sound of the tree hitting the ground echoed through my bones. It wasn't just the noise, it was the finality of it. The deep thud of life being taken without understanding, without permission, without care. I didn't even realize I had clenched my fists until the bark dug into my palm. I had instinctively reached for the nearest downed branch, as though I might raise it like a weapon against the stupidity unfolding in front of me. Instead, I turned my fury into words. "You need to shut everything down, now." Karen Marks narrowed her eyes behind her oversized sunglasses. "Mr. Lorne, if you threaten my crew, I'll have to notify the sheriff." I stepped forward, pointing to the slope just above the stream. "That's federally mapped as a Category 3 flood buffer. Those trees aren't ornamental, they're biological infrastructure. You've just cut into an active hydrological retention zone." She waved me off like a mosquito. "We had our own consultant review the area. He said the trees were overgrown and unstable. We're doing wildfire mitigation. This is about community safety." I almost laughed. "Did your consultant hold a degree in forestry or public relations?" One of the workers slowed his chainsaw, sensing tension. The guy with the backhoe cut the engine, looking from me to Karen. She took a breath. "We followed protocol. You weren't responding to notices." I responded to everyone I snapped, in writing, with evidence, with legal documents, but you never responded back. You knew you couldn't touch my land, so instead you reclassified it without jurisdiction and came in here like you own the mountain. Karen stepped closer, her tone suddenly cold and rehearsed. The HOA voted, unanimously. The resolution has already been filed with the county. You can't file away federal hydrology with a committee vote. My voice carried up the ridge, startling a bird from a high branch. The man with the chainsaw had now fully stopped. I looked at him. "You realize I said if you continue working here, you're complicit in a federal environmental violation. You're not cutting landscaping. You're altering a watershed." Karen turned to the workers. "Keep going. He's bluffing. We've already cleared this with our municipal rep." "No," I said, stepping directly in front of her. "You didn't, because I was the municipal rep. At least I had been. I'd helped write the conservation overlays for this very slope before I ever retired. I still had the original zoning maps, the watershed assessments, the interagency correspondence with FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers. This wasn't just my land. It was a living part of a multi-agency effort to prevent exactly what these fools were unleashing. But all Karen saw was an old man with dirty boots and a bad attitude. "Last warning," she said. "Leave or we'll call the sheriff." I nodded. "Good. Let's all call him. And while we're at it, I'll be phoning the U.S. Army Corps, and the EPA, and the EA Department of Natural Resources. Hell, maybe the local news too if they're not too busy covering wildfires and flash floods caused by idiots with shovels. I turned on my heel and marched back toward the cabin. My legs moved faster than they had in years. I was shaking not from fear, but from the sudden return of a feeling I hadn't felt since I retired. Purpose. Inside the cabin, I tossed the folded flannel off the desk, uncovering a weathered lockbox. I still remembered the combination. I pulled out a stack of manila folders labeled in my own handwriting. Alder Hollow Watershed, Buffer Zones, 1987 to 1993. Then another. Flood Retention Soil Study, verified 2009. I took a breath, then reached for the phone. First I called Pete Harlan, my old Army Corps liaison from back in the day. The line rang twice before he picked up, his familiar gravel voice cutting through. Samuel, I'll be damned. You still breathing up in those hills? Barely, I said. Pete, I've got a situation. Need a field check ASAP. I told him everything. I even emailed scans of the original watershed overlay, annotated with fresh photos I'd taken just 2 weeks ago, trees marked with spray paint bulldozer tracks on the edge of the streambed. Pete didn't hesitate. You're right, Sam. That slope is flagged in our old flood control project. They might not formalized it, but it's a damn critical zone. You think this HOA filed anything to the county about this? They filed fantasy. No environmental review. Just a beautification resolution. Pete exhaled. Okay. Give me 48 hours. I'll get someone on site. 48 hours. That gave me time. Time to compile everything. Time to organize photos, drone images, water flow, data. Time to show that what they saw as overgrowth was actually flood mitigation sediment, control wildlife habitat, and erosion buffer, all the invisible things the land quietly did without ever being thanked. The next morning I watched as another fir tree was felled. My throat burned. That night I finished a 6-page complaint package. Filed one copy to the Corps, another to the EPA, another to the State Department of Natural Resources. I copied in the mayor's office and the county zoning board. By morning, I sent certified letters to each. I also posted a sign on my gate. Notice, this property is under review by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for potential federal environmental violations. Trespassing or unauthorized land alteration may be subject to investigation and fines under federal code. S. Lorne, former conservation officer, Alder Hollow Watershed Project. The next day, Karen showed up again, this time alone. She stood at the gate, staring at the sign like it was written in a foreign language. You're making a scene, she said. You're dividing the community. You divided it, I replied, the moment you decided your aesthetics mattered more than flood protection. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, Karen. You blew it. I'm just making sure you don't bury the consequences under fresh sod and HOA bylaws. She left without another word. And on the third morning after the chainsaws came, I heard something I hadn't heard in weeks. Silence. No machinery, no saws, no voices. Just birdsong wind and the slow, steady hum of justice getting ready to land. The day the machine stopped, the hillside held its breath. It was like the land itself had paused, waiting to see if this quiet was real or just a trick between shifts. I stood at the edge of my property line where the black loam of my slope met the jagged scrape of what they'd already destroyed, and let the silence sink into my chest. The slope looked wounded. A 1/4 acre of trees had already been taken, including 3 I'd known since before I had gray in my beard. Roots jutted from the ground like torn ligaments, and the thin thread of stream that wound down from the ridge had already begun to silt up from loose dirt. The damage was real. It was raw. But it wasn't irreversible. Not yet. I walked the contour line, slowly checking markers, photographing stumps, counting downed trunks. I took soil core samples from where they'd driven the backhoe, carefully bagged each one, and logged the GPS coordinates in an old notebook I hadn't used since 2004. The irony wasn't lost on me. Retirement had made me soft, but nothing gets your instincts back like watching your life's work bleed out under a bulldozer. Back inside the cabin, I laid everything out. My dining table had become a war room, topographic overlays, GIS printouts, drone photos, my original hydrological sketches from the 1990 survey, all annotated and cross-referenced with modern LiDAR data. I opened a file titled Alder Hollow Natural Floodplain Zones Unprotected. and stared at the yellow shaded region. The HOA had cut precisely along the ridge I'd helped identify as a sponge zone, a natural area where runoff slowed, filtered, and fed back into the water table. Destroying that zone didn't just kill trees. It kicked a hole in the valley's natural defenses. And the worst part, they didn't even know. Or worse, they didn't care. I thought about Karen Marks and her smug confidence, how she waved my warnings away like summer gnats. In her mind, HOA rules were gospel. Whatever wasn't visible from her SUV didn't exist. The value of the trees to her was measured in how neatly trimmed their silhouettes looked against the skyline. But she wasn't the only one. Over the years, I'd seen too many communities mistake land management for land control. The difference was everything. Management is stewardship. Control is domination. And domination always comes with blind spots. I opened my laptop and typed a long email to Pete at the course. Attached the new data, the photos, the video footage I'd captured of the cutting crew in action. I ended the message with a personal note. They don't know what they've done, Pete, but if we don't act now, they'll turn this whole slope into a lawn with a view, and next spring's runoff will turn Alder Hollow into a shallow lake. Sam. He replied that evening. Already briefed my supervisor. There's a field team en route. Should be at your gate by Thursday. That was 2 days away. Until then, I waited. I documented, I compiled, I stayed silent but vigilant. Then came the letter. It arrived in a crisp white envelope slipped between my screen door and the frame. No stamp, delivered by hand. Mountain Pines, HOA letterhead. Bolded title. Violation notice and cease and desist warning. I chuckled before I even opened it. Inside accusations of interfering with community projects, harassment of hired contractors, and unauthorized signage displaying threatening language. They even included a printout of my Army Corps warning notice and called it fear-mongering. The kicker, a demand to remove all barriers to Phase 4 beautification within 72 hours. I scanned the signature, not Karen. It was Vice President Paul Gentry. A lanky man with a mustache, so thin it looked penciled on. Paul never looked me in the eye at board meetings. He only smiled like he already knew something you didn't. Apparently, he was now the HOA's legal mouthpiece. Big mistake. I penned my response with a fountain pen, not typed. Ink carries weight. Dear Mr. Gentry, thank you for your concern regarding land stewardship, as you are no doubt aware. Title 33 of the U.S. Code. Regarding navigable waters and wetlands, authorizes federal agencies to intervene when land alterations interfere with documented flood mitigation zones. The area your board has entered without consent is part of an ongoing review by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and is supported by historical data, verified across multiple federal and state environmental studies. As such, I suggest your board refrain from further action until such reviews are complete. Any continued efforts to alter or access this property will be documented and submitted as part of an active federal investigation. With respect, Samuel Lorne, Retired Senior Field Officer, U.S. Conservation Services. I hand-delivered it to the HOA drop box at the clubhouse, then returned to my cabin to wait. The next morning I heard engines, but not chainsaws. It was the low diesel-heavy purr of federal fleet vehicles. 2 black Suburbans rolled up my gravel path, followed by a white pickup bearing the blue and gold insignia of the U.S. Army Corps. Out stepped 3 people. Pete Harlan, a younger woman in field gear with a waterproof clipboard, and a federal environmental officer whose badge I didn't recognize, but who carried herself like she knew this wasn't her first bureaucratic fire. Pete gave me a firm handshake and a tired smile. Sam, he said, looking up at the slope, you weren't exaggerating. Never do, I replied. They spent hours walking the ridge with me, measuring slope angles, photographing cut trunks, sampling runoff. The young woman climbed halfway up the cleared section and tapped her boot on the exposed soil. Already signs of erosion, she said. The roots were holding this whole ledge. Pete frowned. And this stream feeds directly into the hollow basin right. I nodded. Straight shot. And without tree cover, the runoff will spike nitrate loads by 30% minimum. The sediment load will quadruple next time it rains hard. He turned to the officer. We'll need a temporary stop work order. She nodded and made the call. By late afternoon, a laminated federal notice was nailed to the HOA clubhouse door. Work halted under federal review. Any continued land alteration in or near mapped buffer zones may result in civil or criminal penalties under U.S. Code Title 33. Department of Environmental Oversight. Karen screamed, not literally at first, but her rage boiled over publicly in the HOA group chat, which a neighbor kindly forwarded to me. She called the Corps overstepping, claimed I'd duped them with ancient maps, and insisted the land was now HOA easement. But the community wasn't having it. One neighbor asked if they'd voted on a clear-cutting resolution. Another wondered why the HOA never consulted environmental authorities. A third posted drone photos from above mine, watermarked, and wrote, "Why does our greenbelt now look like a logging site?" Within 2 days, the HOA board was holding emergency meetings. Within 3 local news showed up. They wanted to interview the retired scientist who stopped the bulldozers. I declined, because this wasn't about ego. It was about legacy, and they never understood what I meant when I said the land protects us as much as we protect it. They thought I meant poetry, but I meant floodplains. The floodplain maps didn't lie. The silt data didn't lie. The trees that had been standing for half a century sure as hell didn't lie. But when truth faces ego, especially the kind wrapped in khaki slacks, HOA pins, and suburban entitlement, you don't get understanding. You get laughter. The day after the federal stop work order was posted, I received an invitation, if you could call it that, to attend a special discussion at the Mountain Pines HOA clubhouse. The letter was typed, stamped, and sealed with a little gold foil logo, as if that made it official. It read, "We respectfully invite you, Mr. Lorne, to present your position to the HOA board in a civil and neighborly setting. We hope to clarify misunderstandings and reach a mutually beneficial resolution." I knew a trap when I saw one. But I wasn't going there for negotiation. I was going because I wanted to look them in the eye. All of them. I wanted to see if even one of them grasped what they'd done. So I showed up. The clubhouse was absurdly pristine. Faux rustic beams over polished wood floors, and a buffet table offering lemon water and store-bought muffins like it was a damn Sunday brunch instead of a legal quagmire. Karen was there naturally in her signature red vest and tight smile. Paul Gentry sat beside her, flanked by the rest of the board, 5 members, total none, with any background in land management ecology or municipal planning, but all eager to enforce what they called visionary neighborhood aesthetics. There were folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, and I noticed a few residents sitting quietly in the back, maybe curious, maybe concerned, maybe just bored and looking for drama. Karen began with her usual tone of performative grace. "We want to thank Mr. Lorne for joining us and giving us the opportunity to work toward community cohesion." I nodded politely. Cohesion usually requires consent. Paul cleared his throat and took over. "It's our understanding, Mr. Lorne, that you believe the recent enhancements made along the ridge violated some sort of environmental statute." I opened my folder and laid a copy of the original 1989 Army Corps survey on the table. Not statute. Federal hydrological mapping. This is the ridge. These are the contours. And this shaded section, where you cut trees, is part of a delineated flood buffer zone. Karen peered at it like I'd handed her instructions in Greek. "That map is over 30 years old. Hydrology doesn't care how old it is," I said. "The slope, the soil, the watershed, they're all still here, and they don't function by your landscaping schedule." Paul smirked. "So your position is that our community beautification project has interfered with water." Somebody in the back laughed, and that's when I felt it. Not rage, not yet. Contempt. "You didn't even do an environmental assessment before you acted," I said. "You didn't file for a permit. You didn't consult a hydrologist. You didn't notify the course. You didn't even talk to me, your closest neighbor, before you marched in with chainsaws and started leveling the ecosystem." Karen's smile didn't budge. "You were sent multiple notices. I replied to every one. With documentation. You ignored them. You made up your own jurisdiction and hoped no one would push back." Paul leaned forward, arms crossed. "Let's get to the point. What exactly do you want from us?" I stared at him. "I want you to understand what you've done." Another laugh, sharper this time. Karen tried to mask it with a cough. And then came the part I didn't expect. A woman stood from the back row. Short gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses. I'd seen her around the community before but never spoken to her. "Excuse me," she said. "Mr. Lorne, can I ask what exactly happens if that buffer zone is destroyed? Like, what's the worst case scenario?" I turned to face her. In a typical rain year, maybe just soil loss, some stream contamination. But in a flood year, the slope could slide. The water won't slow, it'll rush straight down to the residential basin. That means basement flooding, structural undermining, increased insurance premiums, possibly uninsurable zones. You lose those trees, you lose the sponge. Water doesn't wait for bylaws. Silence. Paul shifted uncomfortably. Karen tapped her pen. The woman nodded and sat back down. "Thank you." That moment, that tiny flicker of someone getting it, was enough. The rest of the meeting devolved into typical HOA theater. Karen rattled off a list of irrelevant community improvements. Paul mentioned the cost of restoration as prohibitively high, and someone even brought up property value optics like we were planning a photo shoot instead of managing a watershed. I let them talk because I knew what they didn't. That 24 hours earlier, I'd received confirmation from the regional EPA office. The case had been elevated to interagency review. The Army Corps, FEMA, and the East State Department of Water Resources were coordinating a formal site inspection, not just of my property, but of the entire HOA-controlled Greenbelt area. Every slope, every drainage ditch, every path they'd carved without permits. Karen and her board were about to be on the receiving end of a full environmental audit. I left the clubhouse without a word. They could laugh all they wanted, but the land wasn't done speaking, and the government was finally listening. That night it rained. Not much, just a summer sprinkle, but enough. Enough to wash a thin film of mud across the newly cut slope. Enough to cloud the stream running past the roots they'd exposed. Enough to carry silt into the culvert at the bottom of the hill, the same one that emptied into their ornamental pond next to the clubhouse tennis courts. The next morning, that pond was brown. By noon, the HOA Landscaping Committee was sending out emails asking if anyone had noticed discoloration in the water feature. I smiled. Nature has a funny way of keeping receipts. The morning after the pond turned brown, I received a phone call I hadn't expected but had hoped for. I was sitting on the back porch sipping coffee from an enamel mug, watching a fox trot quietly across the clearing near the ravaged slope. The clouds were thin, the air unusually still as though the land itself was waiting. I'd spent the last few days gathering data, organizing photos, logging rainfall totals, and stream discoloration. I wasn't doing it for show. I was doing it because I knew the federal process was slow but precise, and the moment it moved with the weight of law. The phone rang. Not my cell, but the old landline I kept on the wall for emergencies. That phone hadn't rung in months. I answered on the second ring. "Mr. Lorne." "Yes." "This is WAPA Field Director, Camilla Ruiz, from the HOA EPA Region 8 office. I'm calling regarding the complaint you filed last week, along with the floodplain mapping and ecological damage reports." "I remember." "Well," she said, her tone both serious and respectful. "I just got off a coordination call with the Army Corps and FEMA. We've reviewed your evidence, and I want you to know we are treating this as a legitimate environmental breach. Our regional director has greenlit a rapid response inspection." My hand tightened around the mug. "How rapid?" "There will be boots on the ground tomorrow. We're dispatching a joint task force to conduct a full site evaluation." I closed my eyes. For a brief moment, the weight of weeks, months really lifted from my chest. "Thank you," I said quietly. "You did the right thing reporting this, Mr. Lorne. If your analysis is accurate, and frankly, we think it is, the HOA may have unknowingly violated at least 3 separate environmental protections, including flood mitigation standards, protected riparian buffer disturbance, and potentially a Clean Water Act clause if silt runoff entered the stream." "It did," I said. "I have samples and time-stamped video. That will help us a great deal. One more thing. Are you comfortable being present for the site review?" "Yes," I said. I wouldn't miss it." We ended the call shortly after, and I sat there for a long time listening to the world breathe. The trees that remained creaked in the breeze. The stream, despite its muddiness, still whispered over the rocks. Life had taken a hit, but it hadn't stopped. Not yet. Not if I could help it. I spent the rest of the day preparing the property. I cleared the walking path that wound down from the ridge to the stream, marked the stumps that had been sawed down, and laid out photo documentation and soil data in labeled plastic folders. My old backpack, faded worn, stitched in places from field seasons past, was filled again with field tools, clinometer core sampler, moisture gauge rangefinder, and an old but reliable GPS unit. That evening, I emailed Pete Harlan at the Corps to confirm the visit. His reply came within minutes. Pete Harlan, we'll be at your gate by 9 a.m. sharp. I'm bringing Ruiz and 2 others from FEMA. You weren't wrong, Sam. Not even close. This might become a textbook case in mishandling flood control buffers. See you tomorrow. I slept light that night. Not from nerves, but from anticipation. For the first time in years, I felt like I was about to finish something, not just react, not just remember, but complete what I'd started back when this land was first surveyed. The slope wasn't just mine. It was part of a larger whole, and it deserved better than to be slashed for someone's view. At 8:58 a.m., I heard the tires crunching gravel. 4 vehicles this time, 2 government-issue SUVs, 1 pickup marked, FEMA Field Division, and a white unmarked car I assumed belonged to someone higher up. Out stepped Pete in his familiar work boots, followed by Camila Ruiz, tall composed clipboard already in hand. 2 others trailed behind a FEMA hydrologist and a young man in a suit who looked too clean to be field staff. Mr. Lorne, Camilla said, extending her hand. Thank you for having us. I shook each hand, then gestured toward the trail. Everything you need to see is down this path. Be careful, it's soft in some areas. We had light rain 3 nights ago. I know, Pete said. Saw it on the gauge. Let's take a look. For the next 2 hours, we walked. I pointed out the tree stumps, the scarred slope, the compacted soil from the backhoe tracks. Camilla took notes, the FEMA hydrologist snapped photos, and Pete knelt several times to inspect root systems and sediment drift. The young man in the suit didn't say much, just observed, occasionally murmuring into a handheld recorder. When we reached the stream, I showed them where it had turned cloudy and deposited fine silt along the banks. The original clarity was excellent, I said. I measured turbidity 2 weeks ago before the disturbance. This is a significant spike. More than significant, said the FEMA agent. This qualifies as runoff-induced contamination under post-construction sediment protocols. Camilla nodded. And the HOA didn't file for a land disturbance permit. No, I said. They called it beautification. No filings, no public notice. No ecological review. Pete looked back up the slope. And they cleared right to the edge of this stream. Yes, he exhaled slowly. That's not just dumb, that's actionable. By noon, we returned to the cabin. I offered water and set the files out on the dining table. Camilla took her time flipping through them. She paused on the annotated floodplain map I'd drawn decades ago. You mapped this. I led the team, I said. Before retirement. It wasn't formalized into an easement, but the Corps filed it under the voluntary flood resilience layer. It's still referenced in the interagency storm model. The man in the suit finally spoke. That makes it part of the informal mitigation record. Not legally protected, but strongly recommended. Any entity disturbing it without coordination bears liability if downstream effects occur. Camilla leaned back, which they already have. Sediment in the pond. Complaints from residents. Elevated risk of floodplain destabilization. She looked at me. Mr. Lorne, with your permission, we'd like to issue a formal federal inquiry into the HOA's actions and freeze all further land alterations under emergency ecological review. You have my permission, I said. It was official. That afternoon, the HOA received notice from all 3 agencies, Army Corps, FEMA, and the EPA. The language was bureaucratic, yes, but the message was clear. You trespassed. You disturbed federally acknowledged flood control terrain. And now you will answer for it. I was told Karen personally opened the envelope on her porch in front of 2 board members. One neighbor described her face as the color of a drowned beet. They tried to hold a closed-door emergency meeting that night, but too many homeowners showed up angry, confused, and demanding answers. Photos were circulating online. The pond's brown hue had gone viral in the local neighborhood forums with captions like, "This is what happens when you ignore science." Or worse, "Karen chopped the trees. Now we're swimming in mud." And I wasn't the one posting them. The tide was turning, not because I shouted louder, but because the land spoke louder than all of us combined. They say the loudest storms don't start with thunder, they begin with silence. The kind of silence that precedes a reckoning. The kind of silence that hung over mountain pines the morning the federal vehicles lined my gravel driveway and parked in full view of the clubhouse engines, off doors swinging wide, as boots hit dirt. It was barely past 900 a.m. when they arrived. 3 black Suburbans with federal plates and 2 white trucks bearing the crests of FEMA and the EPA. I stood on my porch with a thermos in one hand, watching them fan out with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed search party. Clipboard satellite maps, field kits, badges, no smiles, no pretense. This wasn't a visit, it was an investigation. Pete Harlan led the group. He gave me a nod, the kind that said, "Let us handle this," before he turned and marched straight down the slope toward the HOA's greenbelt. Behind him trailed Camilla Ruiz, stern and quiet, and a younger Corps engineer with a drone kit strapped to his back. I didn't follow. Instead, I stepped back into the cabin and retrieved the final folder I'd prepared, my original conservation design from the early 90s. Not the simplified version I had shown the board, or even the scanned copies I'd sent to the agencies. This was the original binder, hand-drawn maps, rainfall absorption tests, the soil depth matrix in my own penmanship, and the original FEMA overlay with my initials in the bottom right corner. I carried it down this trail toward the gathering agents. When I reached the ridge, the sight stopped me cold. They'd set up a perimeter. One of the Corps field staff was using GPS trackers to walk the boundary of what used to be my forested buffer. Camilla was taking photos of the exposed roots and measuring slope angles. Pete stood knee-deep in the stream holding a water testing probe as 2 men from FEMA filmed sediment movement across the channel. And standing at the edge of it all, arms crossed, jaw clenched, was Karen Marks. She had marched out the moment the black vehicles rolled in. She tried, predictably, to assert authority. I'd heard it from a distance. "This is HOA property," she'd said. "You need a scheduled appointment." And Pete, in his gravel-throated calm, had replied, "We're not here for an appointment. We're here for a federal review under authority of the Clean Water Act and the National Flood Resilience Initiative. You'll want to stay out of the way." She hadn't listened, but now standing behind the orange caution tape FEMA had just stapled into the earth, even Karen understood something had shifted. The people in red vests were no longer in charge. I walked over to Camilla and handed her the binder. Her eyes widened. "Is this original?" "Every page," I said. "No one else has this copy. It includes seasonal runoff projections and natural absorption rates. I used this to build the buffer that held back the 1994 spring floods." Camilla flipped through the pages slowly. "This is extremely detailed." "I was younger," I said, almost smiling, "and angrier." She chuckled faintly, then turned toward Pete. "We're adding this to the review packet." Karen, who had inched closer to the tape, raised her voice. "Excuse me, I have questions about what authority you think you have to close off community accessible land." Camilla didn't even turn her head. "Ma'am, this is an active ecological investigation. You are not to cross this boundary. If you have questions, direct them to the regional office in writing. Anything else is obstruction." I watched Karen's face shift defiance, giving way to the creeping realization that this was bigger than HOA resolutions and shade tree trimming. She looked directly at me. "You did this." I met her gaze. "No, you did." I left her standing there stunned and silent as I joined Pete by the stream. "The roots are still wet," he said. "Cutting them destabilized the bank. That last rain pushed a half-inch of sediment downstream. We're already seeing buildup near the clubhouse culvert." I nodded. "There's more coming. We're only in the early part of the season." Camilla crouched near the edge of the stream, holding a laminated map over her clipboard. "We've confirmed the HOA cleared trees along 140 linear feet of mapped buffer. That's a federal violation. And if we determine runoff has impacted the ornamental pond," Pete added, "that becomes a water contamination issue. Civil and possibly criminal penalties." Karen must have heard. She stepped back. Pete glanced at me. "You really kept all of this?" I shrugged. "The land never forgot. I just made sure someone remembered it with me." That afternoon, the agents conducted soil sampling at 6 different points. They pulled moisture levels tested for root decay and compaction, and sent drone footage live to the Corps' regional HQ. By 4:00 p.m., they'd posted a formal federal violation notice on the HOA's community bulletin board. It read, "Under Review Section 404 Violation. The area under HOA modification is now the subject of a joint investigation by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, and the Environmental Protection Agency. All further land alterations, construction, or maintenance in the affected zone are suspended until federal clearance is granted. Civil penalties and restoration requirements pending final assessment. Regional Oversight Division. The notice was photographed and circulated almost instantly. Within hours, residents across the community began calling for a public meeting. Some demanded Karen resign. Others posted angry messages on the HOA forum. Well, why weren't we told about this risk? Who approved cutting trees without permits? My basement flooded last week for the first time in 12 years. Karen tried to post a rebuttal citing misinformation and claiming that a hostile neighbor was weaponizing outdated maps. But the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't the cranky recluse in the woods anymore. I was the man who'd warned them. The land had spoken, the government had answered, and now the entire HOA was on notice. I returned to my cabin as the last federal vehicle pulled away. I made tea. Then I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to the HOA, not to the agencies, but to the land itself. A habit I'd picked up years ago when I worked field rotations. Whenever we left a site, we wrote reflections, not for anyone to read, but to remind ourselves we were just visitors in a living system. My letter said, "You've lost trees, but not memory. You've bled soil, but not strength. I'll stay with you until they learn. I'm still listening." Outside, the wind picked up. The slope, though wounded, stood still. But I could feel it, the land was waiting. By the end of the week, the Mountain Pines HOA wasn't just under scrutiny. They were under siege. Not from protesters or reporters, but from their own neighbors. The silence that had once cloaked their petty mandates was now shattered by the sound of questions. Loud, urgent, and unrelenting. It started with an emergency town hall meeting. The HOA board tried to hold it privately, but word spread. Within hours, over 60 residents packed into the clubhouse, too many for the folding chairs they'd laid out in rows. People stood in doorways, leaned against walls, sat on countertops, their voices rising in waves. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. But my name came up more than once, I was told. "You knew about the buffer zone," one man asked the board. "We followed what the landscaping consultants told us," Karen replied. "But Mr. Lorne said this was federally sensitive land," another resident shot back. "And now we've got a federal notice nailed to our entrance sign. Do you understand how that looks?" Karen tried to stay calm, but her voice wobbled when she claimed I'd exaggerated, that I was emotionally attached to trees and disrupting the harmony of the community. She never expected the retired dentist in the back row to stand up with a printed copy of the Clean Water Act and say, "Actually, I read this last night and I think you're in violation of at least 2 sections." By Monday morning, the HOA email inbox had over 100 messages demanding transparency, including requests for board resignations. People began organizing outside the formal structure, creating a PSOL, Concerned Residents of Alder Hollow group, and drafting a petition to freeze all HOA projects until a full audit was complete. But nothing compared to what came next. On Tuesday, the formal Notice of Violation arrived from the EPA and Army Corps, hand-delivered to the HOA's office by a federal courier. It was concise, severe, and backed with irrefutable data. Here's what it said. Violation Summary. 1. Unauthorized removal of mature vegetation in a mapped flood buffer zone. 2. Failure to obtain land disturbance permits prior to excavation. 3. Documented increase in sediment flow into protected watercourse. 4. Violation of U.S. Clean Water Act Section 404B. Penalties proposed. Civil fines up to $150,000. Mandatory ecological restoration under supervision of the Corps. Temporary suspension of HOA development privileges. Noncompliance will trigger escalation to the U.S. Department of Justice for enforcement. When Karen opened the letter, a neighbor told me she went white as chalk. Paul Gentry, the vice president, supposedly muttered, "We're gonna lose the whole board over this." They were right. That same afternoon, 3 members resigned in sequence. By evening, a 4th had posted a message on the community bulletin board titled, "I can no longer support this administration." outlining how Karen had insisted on pushing the ridge clearing despite his concerns. He apologized publicly. He used the word arrogance. Karen, however, refused to step down. Instead, she doubled down. She filed a cease and desist letter against me, alleging defamation and interference with community projects. She claimed I had orchestrated a media smear campaign and intimidated board members with unfounded threats of legal escalation. It was laughable, really. But I didn't laugh. I responded with a single carefully crafted statement sent to both the HOA's legal counsel and the agencies investigating them. I have never defamed anyone. I have only reported violations that I witnessed, documented, and substantiated through the proper legal and environmental channels. If holding elected HOA officers accountable for violations of federal conservation law constitutes intimidation, then perhaps they are not fit to govern. Samuel Lorne. I copied Camila Ruiz. She replied within an hour, well said. The next day, I received a visit not from Karen, not from the board, but from a couple I barely knew. James and Elaine, who lived 3 lots below me. He was a veteran, she, a retired teacher. They stood at my gate, hats in hand, and thanked me. Most of us had no idea, Elaine said softly. We trusted them. We thought it was just trimming trees. But when the pond started stinking and the stream got cloudy, we realized we'd been lied to. James added, "You protected all of us, Sam, even when we didn't deserve it." I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so long alone on that slope watching the trees grow and fall, feeling more like part of the forest than the community. I never expected to be seen, let alone thanked. Later that evening, I walked the ridge. The damage still made my heart ache. Bald patches of earth tree stumps crusted with mud. Stream banks that once filtered water now slumping into themselves. But the silence felt different now. Not defeated. Held. That's when I heard it. The sound of a car door slamming behind me. I turned. Karen stood on the trail, hands on her hips, face flushed with a fury I hadn't seen since the day of the chainsaws. "You think you've won," she snapped. "No," I said. "I think the land is finally being heard. This community doesn't need a martyr. It needs order, structure, consistency." "No," I said again, quieter this time. "It needs stewardship." She stepped forward. "You embarrassed us. You humiliated this board." "No, Karen," I said. "You did that. I just showed them the mirror." She shook her head. "You're not even part of the HOA. And thank God for that," I said. She turned and left without another word. And I realized, standing there in the last light of day, that this wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about money. It was about humility. About what happens when the people who think they're in charge forget that they answer to something older, quieter, and far more enduring than a rulebook. The forest wasn't gone. Not completely, and neither was justice. It had just begun to grow roots. 2 weeks after the violation notice landed on the HOA's front step, I found myself standing in front of a microphone at the Alder Hollow Town Council chambers, under the sharp eye of 3 city officials, a representative from the State Department of Environmental Quality, and a packed room of neighbors who now watched me, not with suspicion, but with hope. It wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been. The emergency hearing had been called in response to the escalating community backlash and the rapidly unfolding federal investigation. The town had received notice from the EPA that the HOA's actions may have triggered downstream liabilities, including property risk insurance reclassification and even potential federal grant loss for non-compliant ecological zones. The mayor opened the floor with a calm voice and a furrowed brow. "We're not here to assign guilt today," he said. "We're here to understand what happened, what went wrong, and what needs to be done so it never happens again." And then he turned to me. "Mr. Lorne, we understand you've submitted documentation to multiple agencies. The town would like to hear in your words what occurred." I stepped to the microphone. My hand was steady. "My name is Samuel Lorne," I began. "I live at 1311 Ridge Hollow Road, just outside the boundary of the Mountain Pines Homeowners Association. I've lived there quietly for 15 years. Before that, I spent nearly 4 decades in environmental field science, including watershed mapping, flood mitigation design, and federal conservation planning." I paused, not to collect myself, but to make sure they were listening. 2 months ago, the Mountain Pines HOA cleared a swath of forested land behind my property, without proper permits, without notice, and without understanding the purpose that land served. The trees they removed were not ornamental. They weren't overgrown. They were the final layer of defense between hillside runoff and the homes below. Murmurs filled the room. The mayor held up a hand for silence. I continued. This buffer zone wasn't just pretty to look at. It was a biological sponge. It absorbed rainfall, filtered pollutants, and slowed water during high runoff periods. Its removal created immediate sediment flow, which has already contaminated the community pond and destabilized the stream bank. And we haven't even had a heavy rain yet. The DEQ rep leaned forward, flipping through my printed report. I took a breath. I warned the HOA, in writing. With maps, documentation, and legal references. I was ignored, then mocked. And then when the truth came down that what they'd done was illegal, I was blamed. From the back of the room, I heard someone whisper, "He's telling the truth." I turned slightly toward the crowd. This isn't about me. I don't want credit. I don't want vengeance. I want this community to understand that it nearly sabotaged its own safety for the sake of visual cohesion. I held up the laminated page, my 1994 hand-drawn buffer design, now faded but still legible. This map helped protect Alder Hollow from a 5-year flood event 30 years ago. This drawing, this land, was part of a larger effort to save you from yourselves. And this time you weren't so lucky. Silence blanketed the room. Even the mayor had gone still. And then finally someone clapped. A single clap at first from James the veteran, then Elaine, then a few more neighbors. It was quiet, respectful. Not celebration, but recognition. After I sat down, Camilla Ruiz stood next. She walked through the agency's findings: unauthorized land disturbance violation of floodplain management protocols, unpermitted modification of ecologically sensitive terrain. Her voice was even, but sharp. And then she said the words I'd been waiting for. A pending federal approval, Mountain Pines HOA will be required to fully restore the affected terrain to its original condition under direct supervision of U.S. Army Corps engineers and the EPA. Failure to comply will result in escalated penalties, including daily fines, further restriction of community project authority, and possible federal enforcement actions. That's when Karen Marks, seated stiffly 3 rows behind me, finally broke. She stood up, no microphone, and shouted, "This is absurd. He's turned all of you against us with his doomsday science. It was just a few trees." The mayor didn't even flinch. "Ms. Marks, you are out of order. We were just trying to protect our homes," she yelled. "From fire risk, from decay, from pests." Camilla turned toward her calmly. "You didn't protect anything. You endangered everything." Karen stood frozen, jaw trembling. Then she did what people like her always do when cornered. She walked out. No apology. No explanation, just retreat. Her heels clicked sharply on the tile floor as she vanished through the back door. No one followed her. That night, the town board unanimously voted to suspend the Mountain Pines HOA's authority over environmental decision-making until further notice. The homeowners themselves would now vote on any land modifications with third-party ecological review required for all future landscaping over a half-acre. Karen resigned the next morning. Her house went up for sale a week later, and the real work began. Under Corps supervision, a restoration team arrived to begin replanting. Not just saplings, but carefully selected native species pines, cottonwoods, understory brush, reintroducing the exact layers the slope had lost. They brought in erosion netting, reinforced the stream bank, and installed sediment traps until the roots could take hold. They asked me to oversee it. I said yes, not because I wanted revenge, but because I owed it to the land. Because when people forget, the trees remember. The slope remembers. The water always remembers where it's supposed to go. You just have to be quiet long enough to listen. The first shovel of soil hit the ground on a misty Tuesday morning. Restoration began not with fanfare or press releases, but with a quiet team of 3 ecological engineers, 2 Corps-certified reforestation specialists, and myself back in work boots and a field vest I hadn't worn since retirement. My knees ached more than they used to, but my hands remembered everything. The slope was scarred, but not dead. You could still see where the machines had carved crude paths through the undergrowth where stumps had wept resin like open wounds. But under the silt, the roots whispered resilience. The land wanted to heal. It just needed a chance. We began with erosion barriers, co-IR logs, and biodegradable mesh laid across the grade to keep the soil in place until the vegetation took root. Then came the recontouring, gentle reshaping of the slope's flow lines to mimic the natural contours lost to excavation. I oversaw every angle, making sure the ridgelines curved the way water wanted to move, not the way a landscaper thought looked symmetrical. The replanting started 3 days in. Each sapling we placed was more than a tree. It was an apology. Cottonwoods along the lower swale to stabilize the stream bank, blue spruce, and native dogwood higher up to restore canopy balance. Volunteers showed up, residents who once ignored me now offering hands and sweat, and sometimes quiet thanks. I didn't need the words. Their presence was enough. Elaine brought coffee and sandwiches every afternoon. James cleared brush with a veteran's discipline. Even the once dismissive neighbor with the manicured lawn at the bottom of the hill helped dig. We worked in silence most days, broken only by the thump of spades and the occasional crack of a root breaking free. Then one afternoon, Paul Gentry appeared. He didn't approach right away, just stood at the trailhead, watching. When I finally noticed him, I gave a small nod and kept working. He walked closer, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered. I wanted to say, I should have listened, he said. I stood up, wiping sweat from my brow. You were on the board. You had the right to speak. I was afraid of her, he said. Karen. She made it clear anyone who pushed back would be cut out. Replaced! That's not leadership, I said. That's control. He looked at the slope. It's beautiful, even like this. Raw, but alive. It's always been alive, I said. That was the point. We stood there for a long time. I didn't offer forgiveness. He didn't ask for it. But sometimes reckoning isn't loud. Sometimes it's two people standing on wounded earth, understanding the cost of their choices. By the third week, the hillside had begun to green again. Rain fell one night, soft, steady, and long. The next morning, the sediment traps were mostly empty. The stream ran clear. I took a water sample, tested turbidity, smiled. The slope was holding. Camilla Ruiz returned to inspect. She hiked the entire ridge with us, noting growth stability and native species success. At the end of her walk, she turned to me. We'll be closing the enforcement file soon, she said. The restoration is officially in compliance. Does that mean the fines go away? She shook her head. No, the damage still happened. But if they maintain the restoration for 5 years without further violations, the penalties won't escalate. And the HOA, they'll operate under permanent ecological supervision. Every land alteration has to be reviewed externally. You changed their DNA, Sam. This community will never be able to pretend nature is decoration again. That was the real victory. Not the fines, not the resignations, but the memory. The way people now paused at the slope instead of dismissing it. How kids walked the trail pointing at new growth. How residents posted updates online, tracking bird sightings' first blooms, and root survival rates like it was their personal miracle. Someone even put up a small wooden sign, hand-carved, and nailed to a cedar post at the bottom of the trail. Flood Buffer Restoration Zone. Respect the roots. They hold more than soil. I never found out who made it, but I left it there. Late one evening, as summer began to fade into gold, I sat on my porch and watched a deer step delicately through the tree line exactly where the machines had once roared. She paused, sniffed the earth, and moved on, unbothered, at peace. The way things should be. I opened my journal, an old leather one I hadn't touched since the day of the chainsaws, and wrote a single line. The slope remembers. And now finally, so do they. I didn't win anything, really. There were no medals for this kind of fight. Just scars, some on the land, some on the soul, and the quiet knowledge that I didn't walk away. That I stood, that I listened, that I protected something that couldn't speak for itself. And in doing so, I found that maybe I'd protected something inside me too. The first snow arrived early that year. Just a dusting at first, enough to kiss the tops of the saplings and rest in the crooks of branches like a quiet benediction. I stood on the ridge that morning, boot prints crisp in the frost, the wind slicing across my cheeks and threading through the trees we'd planted just 5 months prior. They were still small, spindly in places, but upright, holding on, surviving. I ran my gloved hand over the bark of a young cottonwood, the cold biting through the fabric. Its roots had taken. I could feel it even without checking the data. There was life returning here, and not just because the agencies said so. The land had its own way of confirming things, through wind, through silence, through the sense of something ancient sighing deep in the ground. They call it restoration. but I think of it more as remembering. The earth doesn't forget what it was made for. It just waits for us to stop interfering long enough for it to resume becoming itself. After the final federal review was submitted and the town closed the public hearings, people slowly returned to their routines, but they did so differently now. I could see it. Children were taught about native plant species during community cleanups. The HOA, now entirely restructured with new leadership, launched a conservation subcommittee. Elaine, the retired teacher, chaired it. They asked me to be a consultant. I declined the title, but I promised I'd show up, and I did. We planted milkweed in the lower meadow, reintroduced pollinators, built nesting boxes for kestrels and nuthatches. I walked the trails weekly, sometimes alone, sometimes with neighbors who wanted to learn. I never charged a cent. One day, a boy about 8 years old ran up to me, holding a notebook, and asked if I could help him identify a tree. I knelt beside him and we flipped through pages of sketches and notes. He pointed at a sapling with narrow leaves and asked, "Is that one going to save us from floods too?" I smiled. "It already is," I said. His eyes went wide, like I'd told him a secret, and in a way I had. Winter settled in slow and soft. The land, having endured so much, seemed finally allowed to sleep. And I, for the first time in years, did too. Not the kind of restless sleep that comes with regret, but real sleep, deep, quiet. The kind that only comes when something inside you is settled. One evening, I received a letter in the mail. Not from a federal agency or the town. From a woman named Rebecca Morales, a professor of environmental planning at the university a few towns over. She'd heard about the case, read the agency files, reviewed the maps, even tracked down my original floodplain schematics. "I teach this now," she wrote. "Your buffer zone design is a case study in both ecological planning and civic resistance. I hope you don't mind, but we named the project module after you, the Lorne Line. My students will never forget that slope." I stared at the page for a long time, not out of pride, but out of humility. Because I hadn't done it to be remembered. I'd done it so the land would be. But somehow we'd remembered each other. That weekend I walked the full ridge one more time before the snow grew heavy. I paused by each tree, touching bark, checking mulch, rings brushing frost from low branches, and I left something behind, small wooden tags with tiny inscriptions. One per tree, no more than 5 words each. Hold the water, keep the root, shelter the birds, breathe for us, listen, learn, rise, return. No one would read them but me. That was enough. As I reached the southern edge of the ridge, the sun broke through the clouds for a few fleeting minutes. The light poured across the hillside like a blessing, catching on the frost, turning every branch and blade of grass into glass. I stood there a long time. I wasn't a soldier anymore, or a scientist, or an outsider fighting HOA madness. I was just a man in the place he belonged, where his work met the earth and where justice hadn't come. From the courts, but from the roots. Patient, powerful, undeniable. As I turned back toward the cabin, snowflakes began to fall again. A gentle hush covered the trail behind me. And I swear, if you'd been there, you might have heard it too. The land saying thank you. Not in words, but in wind, but in stillness, but in the way it remembered.